All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan.
Leviathan. Ah, yes.
This 17th century text, it's kind of like a blueprint for a powerful government, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
And it all comes from this, well, let's be honest, pretty pessimistic view of human nature.
Right.
We're going deep into an academic essay today that really dissects Hobbes's arguments.
Okay.
It explores this idea that maybe, just maybe, a strong sovereign is the only way to stop life from becoming nasty, brutish, and short.
Ah, the famous Hobbesian phrase.
Exactly. So, not exactly a lighthearted topic.
Not exactly, no, but fascinating nonetheless.
Absolutely. And I think what makes it even more interesting is that Hobbes wasn't just theorizing about this stuff. He was living through some pretty intense times, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. England in the 17th century, civil war, upheaval, violence everywhere.
You mentioned that, and it really struck me reading this essay, how much Hobbes' historical context shaped his philosophy.
Oh, it's crucial. It's impossible to separate the man from his times. You can't understand Leviathan without understanding the world Hobbes was living in.
So this wasn't just some abstract thought experiment for him. He was experiencing this chaos firsthand.
Exactly. And that experience really permeates his whole concept of the state of nature.
Right, the state of nature. Can you break that down for us a bit? What did Hobbes actually mean by that?
Well, it's essentially a thought experiment. Imagine human life stripped bare. No government, no laws, no social structures.
Okay, so no rules, no one in charge. What happens then?
Anarchy. Pure and simple. Hobbes believed that in this state of nature, everyone's inherently self-interested.
Self-interested meaning.
Meaning driven by their own desires, fears, the pursuit of what they see as glory.
So basically everyone out for themselves.
Exactly. And that leads to, as he put it, the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Wow, okay, paint us a picture. What would that kind of world actually look like?
Imagine a world where there's no one to stop anyone from taking what they want.
Like the Wild West.
Even wilder. No law enforcement, no courts, no one to appeal to for justice.
So basically survival of the fittest, right?
In a very literal sense, yes. And Hobbes believed that in such a world, even the weakest individual could be a threat.
Really? Even the weakest? How so?
Because out of fear, desperation, they might lash out at anyone, even the strongest.
So that creates this constant atmosphere of suspicion.
Exactly. It's a climate of constant anxiety. You never know who to trust, who might try to take advantage of you.
Definitely sounds pretty nasty, brutish, and short to me.
You got it. And this essay we're looking at, it emphasizes just how deeply concerned Hobbes was with this vulnerability.
That makes sense. If there's no one to protect you, you're always at risk.
Exactly. He believed that even people who might naturally be inclined to be peaceful and cooperate would be forced to act selfishly.
Just to survive.
Exactly. It's like this constant pressure to protect yourself, to look out for number one.
Okay, so that's the problem of the state of nature. But what's the solution? How do we escape this Hobbesian nightmare?
That's where things get really interesting. That's where the Leviathan comes in.
The Leviathan. Okay, we've got to talk about this. The name itself, it's pretty intense, right?
Oh, absolutely. Deliberately so.
Yeah.
The Leviathan, this giant sea monster, it's meant to evoke awe, fear, power.
So it's not your typical political theory metaphor.
No, it's not. Hobbes is not messing around here. He's saying, look, this is what it takes to keep society from falling apart.
A giant sea monster of a ruler.
The essay really highlights how deliberate Hobbes was in choosing that image. The Leviathan represents overwhelming power, the kind of power that no one would dare challenge.
So how does this Leviathan, this all-powerful sovereign, actually come into being? Do we just, elect it?
Not quite. Hobbes argued that individuals have to willingly enter into what he called a social contract.
A social contract. Okay, I've heard that term before, but refresh my memory. What does it actually mean in this context?
It means that people give up some of their freedoms, their individual power, in exchange for protection and security.
So it's a trade-off. A bit of freedom for a lot more safety.
Precisely. And the Leviathan, the sovereign, is the guarantor of that safety. They enforce the rules, maintain order, prevent society from sliding back into that chaotic state of nature.
So no democracy here. It sounds like Hobbes wasn't too keen on the whole power to the people thing.
He definitely had his doubts. He believed that without strong, centralized authority, people would be too easily swayed by their passions, their self-interest.
Leading to
Discord, conflict, and ultimately a return to the state of nature.
So the Leviathan is like the ultimate referee, making sure everyone plays by the rules and no one gets too out of line.
That's a great way to put it. And the essay really emphasizes how important this enforcement mechanism is.
Okay, I get it. Rules without consequences are kind of meaningless. But I gotta ask, isn't this whole Leviathan thing, giving one person or entity that much power, isn't that incredibly risky?
Absolutely. That's the big question, the big critique that's been leveled at Hobbes for centuries. What about the potential for tyranny? That's something we'll definitely be unpacking further.
Sounds like we've got a lot more to explore. But before we get into those critiques, I'm curious about the rules of the game, so to speak. Even the Leviathan has to operate within some kind of framework, right?
Right. Even the sea monster has some rules to follow. Hobbes called these the laws of nature.
Laws of nature, so like universal principles of behavior.
You could say that. They're essentially precepts for peaceful coexistence, the kind of guidelines he believed were necessary for any functioning society.
Even one ruled by an absolute sovereign.
Even then, the essay specifically focuses on two of these laws of nature. The first one is pretty straightforward. Seek peace and follow it.
Okay, seems simple enough. Don't start fights, try to get along. What's the catch?
Well, in the context of Hobbes' philosophy, it's not quite as simple as it sounds. Remember, he's coming from this perspective of the state of nature.
Right, where everyone's out for themselves.
Exactly. So in that context, seeking peace can actually be dangerous. If you're the only one trying to be peaceful while everyone else is fighting for survival, you're likely to become a victim.
So peace only works if everyone agrees to play by the rules.
Exactly. And that's where the second law of nature comes in. It's essentially the golden rule.
Ah, treat others as you want to be treated.
Precisely. Hobbes phrased it as, be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself.
Okay, so don't demand more freedom for yourself than you're willing to grant to others. Makes sense. But I can already see the problem here.
What's that?
Even that these laws of nature are completely reasonable, how do you enforce them in a world where everyone's suspicious of each other?
Ah, there's the rub. And that's precisely why Hobbes argued for the Leviathan. He believed that these laws of nature, while rational and desirable, were ultimately toothless without a strong authority to enforce them.
So the Leviathan is like the cosmic hall monitor, making sure no one's throwing spitballs in the classroom of society.
Haha. That's one way to put it. The Leviathan is there to prevent the chaos that inevitably arises when individuals are left to their own devices. They are the ultimate power that keeps the nasty, brutish, and short at bay.
But, I'm still not entirely comfortable with this whole concentration of power thing. What happens if the Leviathan itself becomes the bully in the schoolyard?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it leads us directly into the criticisms of Hobbes' theory, which we'll delve into right after this. All right, so we're back, and we've been wrestling with this concept of the Leviathan.
Right, Hobbes' big solution to the problem of chaos and violence.
This all-powerful sovereign, this sea monster of a ruler.
Exactly. And, we talked about how this Leviathan is supposed to enforce the laws of nature, keep society from falling apart.
Right, but as we were getting into before the break, there are some pretty serious criticisms of Hobbes' theory.
Yeah, I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around the whole giving one entity so much power thing.
It's definitely a cause for concern, and that's something that this essay really dives into.
So what are some of the big problems that people have pointed out with Hobbes' ideas?
Well, one of the most compelling criticisms is that Hobbes seems to completely ignore international relations.
International relations. Okay, help me connect the dots here.
Well, he's so focused on creating internal order within a society, right?
Right, keeping things peaceful and stable within the borders.
Exactly. But he doesn't seem to account for how interactions between nations might affect all of that.
So he's basically assuming that each Leviathan can just operate in a vacuum.
Pretty much. Like, they don't have to worry about what other countries are doing, what kind of agreements they have, what kind of conflicts might arise.
But that seems incredibly naive, especially in today's world where everything is so interconnected.
Absolutely. And the essay really highlights this as a major flaw in Hobbes' thinking.
I mean, it's like trying to build a house without considering the weather, right?
Exactly. You might create this perfectly structured, stable little world inside your house, but if a hurricane comes along, it's all going to come crashing down.
So even if you manage to achieve peace and order within your own society, there's no guarantee that some outside force won't come along and disrupt everything.
That's the point. And it brings us to another major criticism that the essay brings up.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's the assumption that everyone would rationally choose to enter into this social contract with the Leviathan.
Okay, remind me again, what exactly is this social contract?
It's basically the agreement, right, that people make to give up some of their individual freedoms.
In exchange for the protection and security that the Leviathan provides.
Right. Hobbes believed that this was a totally rational choice, that anyone in their right mind would prefer a stable society to chaos and violence.
But not everyone might be so quick to give up their freedom, even if it means a little more safety and security, right?
Exactly. The essay points out that Hobbes might be overlooking the fact that people have different values, different priorities.
Like some people might just value their freedom more than anything else.
Precisely. They might be willing to take their chances in the state of nature, even with all its risks, rather than submit to the authority of a Leviathan.
It's like some people might prefer to live in a small, rickety cabin in the woods where they can do whatever they want,
Rather than in a big, sturdy house with lots of rules and restrictions.
even if that house is much safer and more comfortable.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this critique that I think is especially interesting.
I'm all ears.
The essay points out that Hobbes assumes that everyone is capable of making this rational calculation.
You know, weighing the costs and benefits of the social contract like it's some kind of math problem.
Right. But what about people who are driven by emotion, by ideology, by faith? What about people who just don't trust authority, no matter how much good it might do?
So he's not really considering the whole spectrum of human motivations. The fact that we don't always make decisions based on pure logic.
Exactly. And this ties into another criticism that we've already touched on, the potential for tyranny.
Right, that whole giving one person or group too much power thing.
Even if we accept the premise of the social contract, even if we say, okay, a strong sovereign is necessary to maintain order, how do we guarantee that they won't abuse their power?
That's the big question, right? It's like giving someone the keys to the kingdom and just hoping they don't go on a power trip.
And history is full of examples of leaders who started out with good intentions but ended up becoming tyrants.
Exactly. Power corrupts, as they say.
And the essay makes it clear that Hobbes doesn't offer many safeguards against that.
He doesn't really have a plan for what happens if the Leviathan itself becomes the source of the nasty, brutish, and short.
Not really. He's so focused on the need for obedience and submission to authority that he doesn't seem to consider what happens when that authority goes bad.
So it's like he built this amazing fortress to keep out the barbarians, but he forgot to install a security system to protect against an inside job.
Haha, that's a great way to put it. It really highlights the inherent tension in Hobbes's theory. The very thing that's supposed to protect us from chaos and violence could end up becoming the source of it.
That's a pretty scary thought.
It is, and it raises the question, is there a way to have both order and freedom? Is there a way to create a system that protects us from both external threats and the potential for tyranny from within?
Those are some big questions, and I definitely don't have the answer.
Me neither, but I think it's important to grapple with them, to consider the potential downsides of any political system, even one that's designed to create a more peaceful and stable world.
So what you're saying is that Hobbes, while offering a compelling solution to the problem of anarchy, might also be overlooking some of the more nuanced, more human aspects of the whole thing.
Exactly. He's so focused on creating a system that prevents the worst case scenario that he might be sacrificing some of the things that make life worth living in the first place.
Like individual freedom, creativity, the ability to question authority.
Right. And that brings us to a really fascinating aspect of this whole discussion that we haven't really touched on yet.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that?
It's the psychological impact of living under the Leviathan, even a supposedly benevolent one.
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Imagine living in a society where you're constantly being told what to do, where dissent is discouraged, where the Leviathan has the final say on everything.
Yeah, it could get pretty stifling.
Even if the Leviathan has everyone's best interests at heart, that kind of environment could have a chilling effect on individual initiative, on critical thinking, on the very things that drive progress and innovation.
So it's not just about the potential for outright tyranny.
It's also about the more subtle ways that absolute power can shape the way people think and behave.
Right. Even if the Leviathan isn't actively oppressing people, its very presence could create a kind of learned helplessness.
People might start to believe that they have no agency, no power to change things, and that the only option is to obey.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is, and it suggests that the cost of security and order might be higher than we think, that even a well-intentioned Leviathan could inadvertently create a society that's passive, compliant, and ultimately unfree.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential for abuse of power by the Leviathan, but now you're saying there's also a risk that the people being ruled might become too passive, too accepting of whatever the Leviathan dictates.
Exactly. It's like two sides of the same coin. Too much power concentrated in one place, whether it's in the hands of the ruler or in the mindset of the ruled, can lead to a dangerous imbalance.
And that imbalance can undermine the very foundations of a free and flourishing society.
Precisely. And I think that leads us to a really crucial point. This whole discussion about Hobbes and the Leviathan, it's not just an academic exercise.
Right, this isn't just ancient history. These ideas still matter today.
Absolutely. They're relevant to our own lives, to the way we think about power and government in the 21st century.
So how do we take these ideas and apply them to the world we live in today? What can we learn from Hobbes, even if we don't agree with everything he said?
Well, for one thing, I think Hobbes reminds us that there's always a tension between order and freedom.
That we can't have one without sacrificing at least a little bit of the other.
Exactly. And it's up to each society to decide where that balance point lies, how much freedom they're willing to give up for the sake of security, and vice versa.
And that balance point is constantly shifting, right? What might have worked in Hobbes's time might not work today, and what works in one society might not work in another.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
So it's not about finding the perfect system, the perfect balance once and for all.
No, it's about constant adaptation, constant dialogue, constant vigilance.
So we need to keep questioning, keep debating, keep refining our understanding of how to create a society that's both safe and free.
That's the key. And that's why Hobbes, despite all the criticisms, is still so relevant today.
He forces us to confront these fundamental questions about power, about human nature, about the kind of worlds we want to live in.
Exactly. He might not have given us all the answers, but he definitely gave us the right questions to ask.
And that's a pretty valuable legacy in itself.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we're ready to move into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore how Hobbes's ideas have been interpreted and reinterpreted over the centuries, and how they continue to shape our understanding of power and politics today.
Sounds good to me. Let's see where this Leviathan takes us next. All right, so we spent a lot of time dissecting Hobbes's ideas, the good, the bad, and the, well, maybe a little bit scary.
Right. The Leviathan is a pretty imposing figure.
Definitely. But now I'm curious, how have these ideas actually played out in the real world?
That's a great question. And you might be surprised to learn just how much Hobbes's thinking has shaped the way we think about power and government today.
Really? So it's not just some dusty old philosophical text?
Oh, not at all. Hobbes's Leviathan has cast a long shadow, so to speak, influencing the development of modern political systems in ways you might not even realize.
Okay, give me some examples. Where can we actually see Hobbes's fingerprints on the political landscape?
Well, one of the most enduring legacies of Hobbes' thought is the concept of the social contract.
Right, we talked about that earlier. The idea that individuals willingly give up some of their freedoms in exchange for security and stability provided by the government.
Exactly. And that idea has become absolutely central to modern political philosophy.
So it's not just some abstract concept that Hobbes came up with. It's actually shaped the way real-world governments function.
Oh, absolutely. Look at democratic systems, for instance. The very foundation of democracy rests on this idea of a social contract.
How so?
Well, think about it. Citizens consent to be governed by elected representatives, they agree to abide by the laws, and they participate in the political process, all with the understanding that the government, in return, will protect their rights and provide for their well-being.
So even though we don't literally sign a contract when we're born, the idea is that we're implicitly agreeing to this exchange of freedom for security just by living in a democratic society.
Exactly. And this notion of consent, the idea that a government's legitimacy stems from the will of the people, can be traced back to the social contract theories that Hobbes helped popularize.
So even though Hobbes was writing centuries ago in a very different political context, his ideas still resonate today, even in systems that are very different from the absolute monarchy he was advocating for.
That's the power of ideas, right? They can transcend time and place and continue to shape the way we think about the world, even if the specific forms they take on might evolve.
And it's not just democratic systems, right?
Right. The idea of the social contract has been applied to all sorts of political systems, even authoritarian ones.
Really? How does that work?
Well, even in authoritarian regimes, there's often an underlying assumption of a social contract, even if it's not explicitly stated or freely chosen.
So what you're saying is that even when the power dynamic is very different, there's still this idea of an agreement between the rulers and the ruled, even if that agreement is more implied than explicit and maybe not entirely fair or balanced.
Exactly. The rulers might claim that they are providing order, stability, or economic prosperity, and in exchange, the people are expected to obey their dictates, even if they don't have much say in how they're being ruled.
It sounds like Hobbes's emphasis on the need for a strong central authority to maintain order is still very much alive in various forms of government, even if the way that authority is established and maintained has evolved over time.
Right. The idea of a powerful executive branch, a president or a prime minister, responsible for making tough decisions and enforcing the law that can be traced back, at least in part, to Hobbes thinking about the Leviathan.
So even though we might not have giant sea monsters ruling over us literally, the idea of a strong, decisive leader at the helm is still very much with us.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to that central tension that we've been talking about throughout this whole discussion. How to balance the need for a strong, effective government with the dangers of unchecked power.
Right. How do we ensure that the government has enough power to do its job, but not so much power that it becomes oppressive?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that every society has to grapple with.
It's like walking a tightrope. Too much power in one direction, and you get tyranny. Too much in the other, and you get chaos.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding that sweet spot, that delicate balance between order and freedom, security and individual rights.
So it's not a simple either proposition.
Not at all. It's an ongoing process of negotiation, adaptation, and compromise.
So there's no easy answer, no perfect formula for creating the ideal government.
Nope. And that's what makes political philosophy so interesting, right? It's about grappling with these complex questions, recognizing that there are always trade-offs, and trying to find the best possible solution for a given time and place.
So what you're saying is that even though Hobbes might not have given us all the answers, he gave us a framework for thinking about these issues, a set of concepts and questions that are still relevant today.
Exactly. And I think that's ultimately the most valuable thing we can take away from Hobbes. It's not about agreeing with everything he said. It's about engaging with his ideas, challenging them, and using them as a springboard for our own thinking about power, government, and the kind of world we want to create.
It's about recognizing that these aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They have real-world consequences that affect all of us.
Precisely. And it's up to each of us to educate ourselves, engage in thoughtful discussion, and participate in the political process in whatever way we can to help shape a future that's both just and free.
So it's not just about reading Hobbes or understanding his theories. It's about taking those ideas and applying them to our own lives, our own communities, our own understanding of the world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we are all part of this grand experiment, this ongoing effort to create a more just, more equitable, more humane world. And while Hobbes might not have given us all the answers, he certainly gave us some pretty powerful questions to ponder, questions that continue to resonate centuries later.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've explored his ideas, we've unpacked the criticisms, and we've even touched on some of the psychological and social implications of his thinking.
And I think what we've discovered is that Hobbes, despite all his flaws and controversial ideas, was onto something really important.
Right. He was wrestling with these timeless questions about power, authority, and the nature of human beings. Questions that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And I think that's a testament to the enduring power of ideas and the importance of engaging in critical reflection about the world around us.
So whether you agree with Hobbes or not, I think we can all agree that his work has left an indelible mark on our understanding of politics and society.
I completely agree. His work serves as a reminder that these questions about power, justice, and the kind of world we want to live in, these aren't just abstract theories. They have real-world consequences. And it's up to each of us to engage with them thoughtfully and critically.
Absolutely. So thank you for joining us on this intellectual adventure. We hope you've enjoyed exploring these complex and challenging ideas with us.
And we hope that this deep dive has sparked some new thoughts and questions for you to ponder.
Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep striving to create a better world, one deep dive at a time.